Your Excellency, I'll use that term if I may. It's a pleasure to see you. You look fabulous for what? Is it 84 years old, 83, 84?
On the 10th of April, I'll be 84.
84 years old. Amazing. What do you drink? What do you eat? What's the secret of your youthfulness and vitality first?
I think I've been blessed with good genes, and it's now 13 years since I've retired as Prime Minister of Jamaica. So the weight is off my shoulders, and I can just take each day as it comes and give thanks to the Almighty.
Of course, we will talk about some of that weight that seemed to have been on your shoulders during the time of your premiership. But you say you've retired. Have you really retired? You've retired from Jamaican politics?
I retired from public office in Jamaica, but I continue to be engaged at a different level from the pavilion. I happen to be a member of a number of groupings which involve persons who have served in political life. There's a Global Leadership Foundation. I'm actually on my way to Ireland for a meeting of the GLF later this week. I also am a member of the Club of Madrid and the Interaction Council, both of which seem to intend to engage persons who have served in political leadership in contributing to the ongoing dialogue which stimulates the conduct of international relations.
You're certainly the elder statesman of Jamaican politics, if not you, Edward Siaga, but both of you jointly are. And although you come from opposing parties, I imagine you meet up for a drink and exchange some memories.
We have developed a very good working relationship. There are a number of matters of national import where we converse, and on occasions we indicate what our views are, not necessarily jointly, but separately, usually with the objective of seeking to promote national unity.
Jamaica is very lucky to have two giants of its political history able to, from the wings perhaps, in the shadows, to guide the country and maybe guide the current politicians as well. Are you?
In fact, Jamaica is fortunate. We have 4 retired prime ministers. There is also former Prime Minister Bruce Golding and former Prime Minister Portia Simpson Miller. And all of us in our different and separate ways endeavor to make a contribution to promoting the national good.
Your specific political journey began in somewhat humble surroundings in the parish of Hanover in 1935.
That's correct.
Just take us back to that. What are your earliest memories?
I come from a part of Jamaica which was adjacent to Frome, where the first sparks of protest and the search for or assertion of the right to determine our own affairs was first ignited. I was aware as a little child growing up that there was a hustle and bustle around me of unusual proportions. Of course, I didn't grasp the significance then. A few years later, we were granted universal adult suffrage. And from then, I began to be more conscious and more aware of the struggles we were undertaking as a people. I come from a family with a background mainly of the church and education. And these were the primary agents promoting the need for change and for the recognition of human dignity. At that time, and very soon, Marcus Garvey was preaching the gospel of the right of persons of color to be treated with equal respect and for dignity as a people. And that, of course, spawned a political movement working alongside with the leadership of the workers. In fact, in the earliest days, Bustamante and Norman Manley were contributing in their own distinct ways to that struggle. Later, we saw the emergence of two political parties, and our attempts to build a democratic society were pursued through a process that has seen changes taking place from time to time in the political landscape. I think it's to the credit of Jamaica that I would say after the years of independence, we've been able to change governance, and that's accepted generally. In fact, the last election, a party won by a single seat, and yet despite that, the new prime minister could be sworn in with the outgoing prime minister on the podium, with members of the old cabinet present, with members of the new cabinet present, and it was done certainly without the firing of a single shot or without any outside interference or influence. I think it's a sign of our growing political maturity as a people.
You've unpacked some 84 years of Jamaican political history there, and some of it is loaded, and I'll try and take up some of the issues that you brought up there. And I'll get on to whether it's a duppy or a gunman as well, I assure you. First of all, were you aware, as you were growing up, that your father was one of the few black landowners in the country?
I wasn't conscious of it at the time, but I watched how my father developed his interest in land. He was mainly in the field of animal husbandry. He not only dealt with his own property interests, but certainly gave support to those around him. He was, of course, active in the church, in the community where we lived, and I think his passion for ensuring that children and the elderly were properly cared for is something which I learned from him and became a habit.
Because, of course, there was still a lot of discrimination colour discrimination in Jamaica at this time, even though the sentiments of the national motto, out of many people, we are one, is laudable. But, let's be real. Let's be real now. You yourself would face discrimination when you, as the Minister of Tourism of all things, would go to try and stay in a hotel in Montego Bay many years on.
Yes. First of all, it has to be recognized that the people from Jamaica came from different parts of the world in different circumstances. But it can't be denied that the majority of the people owe their ancestry to Africa and are black in color.
And didn't arrive there voluntarily?
Certainly not. That's a whole episode about some portions of which I have written in my book, and which, of course, still has lasting effects on patterns of relationship and behavior in our Jamaican society today, and affect our history and our relationships with the metropolitan countries. As of now, the whole question of reparations, which some people don't want to hear about, is a case which we in the Caribbean simply cannot abandon, because we need justice. But I was privileged to gain one of the few scholarships at the time and entered a secondary institution. And there, people came not only from different parts of Jamaica, but indeed from different countries in the Caribbean. Descendants, sons of persons who were Jamaicans, but had gone there to participate, whether in the building of the Panama Canal or working in the fields in Cuba, in Venezuela. The first time that I was actually exposed to racial discrimination, it took me a little while before I recognized what had happened. Then, of course, by the time I came to the United Kingdom to study for my law degree, I had had a taste of it, but I quite frankly wasn't well prepared for some of what I saw. You would apply, you'd see a flat advertised and go for the flat, and the landlord took one look at you and told you that the flat was no longer available. Some would have the effrontery to say, blacks weren't welcome here. So I've run the gamut. But I think one of the things in Jamaica which we don't always appreciate and we sometimes take for granted is that there's so many people, different color, different ethnic origins, Chinese, Indians, persons from the Middle East, unquestionably Jamaican. And out of that, we have what I would say built a cultural feast. There's so many things that infuse the Jamaican culture. I think we ought to emphasize more of the commonalities within our society rather than the differences which undoubtedly still exist.
Granted, and I don't want to labour the point, but nevertheless, you being the 6th Prime Minister of Jamaica were undoubtedly the first Jamaican Prime Minister who was black.
The first one chosen as a result of the popular vote, Mr. Shearer, who was the 4th, became Prime Minister as a result of the sudden death of Donald Sangster. And it was the parliamentary group that made him. But the first person unquestionably a black happened to be me.
But like you say, that's not as important perhaps as what Jamaica has been able to achieve over the course of the 20th century. You mentioned in passing some of the architects of modern Jamaica, Sir Alexander Bustamante and Norman Manley. These aren't just historical figures to you, these are people that you met and knew.
Oh, certainly, persons with whom I had considerable association. And in the case of Sir Alexander, when I began my political apprenticeship, he said to me he knew who I was because my maternal grandfather had been the principal of Cocoon School where he attended. And his words to me were, "You come from good family stock. What are you doing in my cousin's party?" And I would say that...
his cousin being Norman Manley.
Of course. Whenever he saw me, he was always giving me advice, including strongly suggesting that I ought to go to pursue my career in law, in the hope, as he said, that I'd be half as good in law as his cousin Norman, because Norman Manley, as a lawyer, in his opinion, was twice as good as all the other lawyers put together.
Well, it's true.
Insofar as Norman Manley is concerned, I've said in my book, he's my lodestar. He's the person under whose political leadership I served my apprenticeship. I have written in the book about discussions we had here in London when he came for the independence talks. I was then a student at the London School of Economics. I was privileged to join him in a number of campaigns. I watched his approach to organization. I watched his approach to national leadership, and very, very significantly, I came to appreciate the power of legislative action to effect meaningful social change.
And why I say it's true, Norman Manley was better than the best of the lawyers that Britain could throw at him when he was challenging Britain for the if you like, the preamble to the independence of Jamaica, is that he wiped the floor with them, essentially. That's the history that Jamaica needs to be told, isn't it?
Oh, yes, certainly.
He did wipe the floor with them. As a lawyer, in your book, you reveal that you were the barrister that defended the great Don Drummond when he was charged and subsequently found guilty on grounds of insanity of the murder of his partner. As a lover of Jamaican music, Don Drummond, for me, still holds a very special place. What do you remember about that trial and the Don Drummond that you saw and you defended?
I came to serve as the manager of the greatest musical aggregation that Jamaica has ever seen, and
the Scatterlights,
and will ever see, in my view, the Scatterlights, a band of stars. And I came into that position largely because of Don Drummond. Time and time again, at the end of a week, the proceeds from their performance had been distributed. He hadn't expressed any interest in taking anything. He only came, played his music, and left. And Margarita, his partner, would turn up at our office on a Friday and say we have no money. So first of all, we took it out of our own pockets, Tony Spalding and myself, who shared chambers, and eventually I stepped in and ensured that the band was put on a proper footing insofar as payments were concerned to the members. I mention that because it is Don Drummond that caused me to come in, and it was also Don Drummond who I had Tony Spalding and myself to defend. He was a loner. He was a mystic person. He lived only for his music. But one could detect a form of melancholia that was always evident in him. I can't remember ever seeing him smile or laugh. But when he was excited, he would express it through his music.
And his trombone.
Oh, certainly his trombone. Very often, when the band was finishing on a night, he would pick out individual members and he would say to them, "We're going to cut a tune tomorrow." And they would ask him, "Have you written the music?" He says, "No, just bring your horn or bring your instrument." And he would start and they would accompany him and he would continue and they would step up to the plate. And that's how most of his great innovations were done.
One important part of Jamaican history there is the music. It strikes me that you're not the only former Prime Minister of Jamaica.
Certainly not.
That has either managed or produced music, because we know Edward Seaga, for example, was a great record producer as well in his time. And we know that arguably your direct mentor was Michael Manley, at least that's how it appears in your book. Michael Manley wasn't averse to using a Joshua reference to aid his political fortunes.
The music played a great part in our campaign in 1972. It was reflecting the feeling of protest. It was reflecting a feeling of resentment that despite some economic progress, the inequalities were still evident and in fact increasing. It was reflecting the want of a better life for the Jamaican people, summed up in Better Must Come, which was our main campaign song. Prior to the elections, we had a bandwagon campaign which took the best musicians right throughout the country. And the music said it all. We just, certainly Michael Manley articulated that feeling of yearning for social justice. That's what the music.
Socialism with democracy was his slogan.
Correct.
And he captured, at a very radical time for Jamaica, it seemed, he and you, a central part of his government, seemed to capture the mood of the country, not just of the country, maybe of people of African heritage right throughout the diaspora, because this is the time of...
Well, the struggle for freedom, the struggle for liberation was not confined to Jamaica, extended well beyond our shores. We felt that where there was oppression anywhere, there was oppression everywhere. Particularly, I would mention in this conversation the privilege I had of traveling with Bob Marley from London to Salisbury, as it then was, Harare, as it now is, when we celebrated the independence of Zimbabwe. And the people there conveyed in no uncertain terms their appreciation of what the music had done to inspire and fortify them in the struggle.
Yeah, they could have been singing not just Africans liberate Zimbabwe, but Jamaicans liberate Zimbabwe, because that tune by Bob Marley was the anthem of the day.
Definitely so.
Throughout Zimbabwe. Okay, if we move forward, you served under Michael Manley, and then as he became ill, he passed over the baton of the leadership of the PMP to you, and for you to become Prime Minister. And he wrote a very moving letter to you. I don't know, I read the letter and I could hear the voice of Michael Manley almost, as he knew that the times they are changing, that he had done his part. How much of you started off this interview by talking about the burden of being Prime Minister. How much did you feel that burden at that point? Did you know what you were taking on?
I had been involved in the government of Jamaica, certainly from 1972 to 1980, as Minister of Industry, Foreign Trade and Tourism firstly, and then as the Minister of Foreign Trade, Foreign Affairs and Tourism. And then we lost the elections in 1980. When we returned to office in 1989, I was restored as the Deputy Prime Minister and placed in charge of development, planning, production, and for a year as the Minister of Finance. So I would say that I had a good grasp of the challenges which we faced. I separated the two periods deliberately because in the interval, the whole world order was changing. Certainly, the Soviet Union was disappearing, and the dominance of globalization and the insistence on the market economy had appeared. So we had to make significant adjustments in our policy and our programs from 1989 onwards. And I was a leader of that process even before becoming Prime Minister in 1992.
And this was a time when Edward Seaga was describing your PMP government as communist.
Yes, and we had suffered from that electorally, and to some extent our international image had been distorted, and we had to get things
But did
right.
he not have some justification there? Because under Michael Manley, your PMP government aligned itself with Cuba, with Fidel Castro, who clearly is a communist or was a communist leader.
I have said it in the book, and I'll say it very simply. In the fight for independence globally throughout the world, and particularly in Africa, where apartheid still existed, where the decolonization process had been stalled in places like Namibia, in Zimbabwe. There was no difference of outlook between Cuba and ourselves. It's not about following the Soviet ideology. It's about the assertion of our right as independent people to discharge our sovereign competence over our people and the assets which we own. Now, in terms of the internal political situation, how we organize things, we were never seeking to follow the Cuban model in terms of their internal arrangements. We have always been a democratic-oriented party, internally and nationally. So I have made it pretty clear, as reflected in several discussions we've had with the Cubans, that the idea that we were about to apply a Cuban model for the Jamaican political situation really has no foundation.
But nevertheless, Jamaica was aligning itself internationally, whether it be with Cuba, whether it be with Venezuela, whether it be with other interests. It affected the economy.
Stop a minute. You mentioned Venezuela. There's a distinct difference between the Venezuela pre-Chavez and the Venezuela post-Chavez. And let it be said, we had good relationships with Venezuela before Chavez and during and since Chavez. In fact, our relationships with Venezuela go way back from the time of Simon Bolivar. A point I want simply to make is a sovereign country has to determine what is best for itself, not what others want for it. What it wants for itself. And that's what we in Jamaica, the party that I have had the honor to lead and to serve, has always been about.
But whilst you were looking outwards as an internationalist, whilst you were making connections all across the world, in Africa, of course, you mentioned the delegation that you and Michael Manley led to countries like Nigeria, to Ghana. You brought back the rod of correction from Ethiopia and so on. Whilst you were looking outwards, there were real problems in Jamaica, which you yourself addressed in your inauguration. You said the primary issue in this country, I mean, you said two things, and I'll come on to the second one in a moment. You said the primary issue in this country, and it became something of an anecdote that still lives out there, is, you quoted the Ernie Smith song, Duppy or a Gunman. You said, it must be a Duppy or a gunman. I may not find out yet, but I'm telling you now, it's the gunman that is the real problem here in Jamaica. And that was what the legacy of a decade at least of political fighting had resulted in. A plethora of guns and gunmen walking the streets of Jamaica and causing havoc. That was the real issue to deal with, not how Jamaica was being perceived internationally, surely.
From the end of the 60s, and again it's evident in the music of the times, we were developing what the musicians themselves describe as the rude boy. And that continued to go down the wrong path.
Because there was no work for the rude boy at the time. There was no opportunity. Remember, that was your mantra when you became Prime Minister. Opportunity.
That's correct. By certainly the 1990s, it was not so much the political element that was driving the violence. In fact, I would say steps had been taken which virtually removed politics as a driving force for the violence. It was mostly in relation to fighting for turf, fighting for territory, and a lot of it was around drugs, and the more that pressure was put on containing it or addressing it on the drug front, it then moved to scamming. And it's still the very biggest problem, even now, while the economy is doing much better, certainly.
Sorry, scamming. What do you mean by scamming?
Lottery scamming. Persons inducing innocent and particularly elderly people in the United States that they have won some lottery and they have to send some money for it, and the persons engaged in it are fighting locally for control, and even when the proceeds have been obtained and they feel they are not being properly or evenly distributed, violence enforcement becomes the order of the day.
I wonder whether, when you look back, I can think of many achievements of your time as Prime Minister. You changed the landscape, definitely in terms of education, opportunities in terms of jobs, and so on. What would you say was your greatest achievement as Prime Minister in Jamaica?
I would say managing to help in the release of our creative potential as a people. Getting persons in Jamaica to understand and accept that knowledge, education, opportunities constitute the way forward, not only for ourselves as a nation, but for each person as an individual.
Where does that creative power come from? We've seen Jamaica punching above its weight musically. We've seen it punching above its weight in terms of athletics, particularly sprint. We've seen it punch way above its weight in the cultural impact it's made here in Britain. You know, every other younger person talks of a little bit of Jamaicanese about them, whether it's absorbed through the music or through the diaspora, the Jamaicans who came here and changed the nature of this country from Windrush forwards. And so where does that creative power comes from? It's immense.
It's partly that combination of accumulated experience of hardships, of aspirations, the blend that is due to bringing together persons from Africa, India, China, Lebanon, Europe, and putting them in a Caribbean space with the endowment of nature, with the proximity to North America and the impact of the cultural influences which flow, of our linkages through history, and the experiences of our people over time. And I think we have been abundantly blessed, and it's how we nurture it, and it's how we expose it. You mentioned in your question to me all the areas in which we have excelled. We've also done it in areas of science, in medicine, in literature, in sports. There's nothing that we can't achieve. We can make it if we keep on trying.
And just a final point, if that's the case, if we accept that, then it would seem to me that the greatest duty, or the a priori duty of any Prime Minister of Jamaica is to paraphrase the great poet Louise Bennett, Miss Lou, you know, if we boil up the culture, you know, it would seem that that the most important role of a prime minister is to maintain that X factor, that cultural.
Let's be ourselves and make the best of what we are and what we can achieve together.
Your Excellency PJ Patterson, thank you very much. The book is My Political Journey, Jamaica's 6th Prime Minister, speaking in his own words. Thank you.
Thank you.